In a week where Kamala Harris was in the news for becoming a vice presidential candidate here as we head into the election, the wrestling world lost somebody who not only shared the same first name, which made for a lot of very confused people on Twitter when they saw the hashtag RIP Kamala trending, but they also shared the same last name too. James Kamala Harris died at the age of 70. 4 days before he died, his wife said that he had been diagnosed with COVID. He probably contracted it from one of the many weekly visits that he took to the dialysis center that he frequented. He had a lot of pre-existing health issues that have been well documented. Diabetes, that's what led to him having both of his legs amputated over the years. But he was feeling better. I guess he went into the hospital. He started feeling a little bit better. And then last Sunday, he went into cardiac arrest, and he passed away. And so that was a pretty, sad thing to hear. I heard about it right after, in fact, I finished recording the Sound Off last weekend, so I didn't have a chance to talk about it then on the podcast. My earliest memories of Kamala, and I'm sure the first time I saw him, it had to have been on one of the syndicated shows, so I probably saw him the first time on an episode of Superstars or Wrestling Challenge. But my earliest memory, when I think back, what is my earliest memory of Kamala? It was a match that he had with Jake the Snake Roberts on an episode of Saturday Night's Main Event. And this would have been sometime in 1987. And he scared the crap out of me with that. He had that giant tribal mask and the spear that he carried around, and the music. For some reason, the music terrified me. I think I still have my Kamala LJN figure in my closet somewhere. I did keep some of them. A lot of them, unfortunately, got thrown out many years ago, but I did manage to hold on to some of them. They're not in the best condition because I beat the crap out of all of them when I was a kid, but I probably still have, I would say, I don't know, maybe 20 or so of those giant rubber LJN figures from when I was a kid, and Kamala is one of them. By all accounts, one of the nicest guys, and that's according to the people who knew him, the people who shared a locker room with him, and that's a rare thing. I mean, at least back then, it seems like that was a rare trait, to be well-liked by pretty much everybody who knew you and everybody that you worked with. I believe it was Andre the Giant who got him into WWE the first time in '84, and the two of them worked together, and he worked with Hulk Hogan on top that year for the championship at least once. That's not the year they had their big program together, but they had at least 1 or 2 matches that year for the championship. He did work with Hogan a lot more when he came back in '86, '87. Vince McMahon wanted to bring him back to work a program with Hogan that year for the title. But he just didn't think that he was being paid fairly enough by the company. He didn't feel he was being paid what he felt other guys working on top were being paid. And so he left again. So he had left the company for a second time. Now, he first worked as Sugar Bear Harris. Early in his career, he was actually managed by Percy Pringle. So years later, when he would feud with The Undertaker, Paul Bear was the manager of The Undertaker. Paul Bear, many years earlier, had managed Kamala under a completely different name and a completely different character. Some people have incorrectly mentioned or believed. I even got one email from somebody who wanted to know, is that the most racist gimmick that Vince McMahon ever came up with? And what they don't understand is that Vince McMahon did not come up with the Kamala character. He did not come up with the Kamala character. You can lay a lot of things at the feet of Vince McMahon, but this is really not one of them. The Kamala character was the brainchild of Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett when he worked back in the Memphis territory. And many years ago, Jerry Lawler was a guest on the Steve Austin podcast. And he talked about it. He told the story. He was at probably the Mid-South Coliseum one night. The matches were going on, and Lawler was in the back, and I guess he was looking out, watching the matches. And he claims he got a tap on the shoulder, and when he turned around, there was James Harris. And he was saying, Mr. Lawler, I wrestle, and I just wanted to know if, there was an opportunity here to work in Memphis because I'm looking to work. And Lawler says he was looking at the guy and there was just something in his head that went off because here's this big guy, right, who's tapping him on the shoulder. And he says to Kamala, he goes, and this is before he was even Kamala, he looks at Harris and he just goes, "Has anybody seen you?" And he goes, "No, sir, I came in through the back door." He goes, "All right, listen, my locker room is right over there. Go into my locker room and just sit there and wait for me. Make sure nobody sees you." Right? Because this was back in the time of kayfabe. He didn't want him walking around and the fans see him, and then 2 weeks later, all of a sudden, this guy's on TV with a completely, different character. So it was important that he not be seen. So he went off into Lawler's dressing room. And Lawler eventually, they came in and he kind of huddled up with Jerry Jarrett, and they're looking at this guy. And Lawler thought of this classic painting. It was this Frank Frazetta painting, I think was the name of the artist. I had looked up, because I remember the story, and then I looked up to see what the artist was. I think it was Frank Frazetta. And he says that there was a painting of a woman tied to a stake. And I think she was being surrounded by these headhunters or these African cannibals or whatever the depiction was. And he envisioned Kamala as one of these, cannibals, that had a certain look, and they had the spear as like some kind of tribal warrior or something like that. And it made him think of that painting. It made him think of that, and he started sketching out different patterns and designs for Kamala and the face paint and all that kind of stuff. And that, it just kind of went from there. They said, "Look, the next day, I want you to come on over to," I think it was Jerry Jarrett's farm. He had this big farm, all these acres in Tennessee. And so they invited Harris up there, and that's where the character came to life. Lawler, I think, had a copy or a picture of the painting. And Lawler is a fantastic artist. I mean, Jerry Lawler is absolutely just a brilliant artist if you've ever seen his work before. I mean, Bret Hart is a good artist too. I remember back they used to sometimes compete with each other in the locker room in WWE, because they were both very good artists. But Lawler is just fantastic. And so they went to work and they started sketching things out, and they filmed early vignettes for the Kamala character, I think, on Jerry Jarrett's farm, acting as if he was in the deepest, darkest Africa, like in the African jungles or something. It was his farm in Tennessee. And they were filming, different vignettes for him. And Kamala said that, once said that Lawler was, worried that maybe he would be offended by the gimmick. So he was being very careful when he first pitched it to him. Obviously, he as an African-American, he wants to portray him as some kind of cannibalistic savage. Talk about stereotypes. So all of a sudden, it's as if everybody from that part of the world looks and acts exactly like this. And so he was worried. He didn't know what Harris would think. He didn't know if he would be offended by it. He said he wasn't. He said he just looked at it as he was playing a character, And he once made the comment, he said that racist humor, he said, didn't bother him. This wasn't racist humor per se, but he made the comment once, racist humor didn't bother him. What bothered him were racist promoters who did not pay you the same as they paid other performers just on the basis of you being black. He said that's what really offended him. The character didn't offend him. He apparently offered his own insights into little tweaks to it and things of that nature. So he was all in on the Kamala character and embraced it. And that was the genesis of the character. It had nothing to do with Vince McMahon, whether you want to blame him or give him credit for the success of it. It was not his idea. It was the brainchild of Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett. So he sat down, I want to say a couple of years ago. It wasn't that long ago. He was already in a wheelchair at this point, 2017, 2018, I think. He sat down for an hour-long shoot interview from his home with Hannibal on Hannibal's YouTube channel. The audio quality on it was not good, but I did watch that. I've watched a lot of the shoot interviews on Hannibal's channel, just giving him a quick shout out here. There's a lot of really great ones. A great one with Demolition on there. But I remember I watched the Kamala one. I watched it a while back, actually. And it's always good to hear these people in their own words. And I think it's a good, if you've never seen it before, it'd be good for you to go back if you're interested and just hear some of the things that he had to say. But he talked about how he worked as a truck driver before he got into wrestling. And, he got into wrestling thinking that it was the only way to make more money. That's why he got into the business in the first place. I guess as a truck driver, he wasn't making enough, which I can understand. I mean, my father was a truck driver. I wish my father was still around. I don't think he ever knew that Kamala was a truck driver. I just think he'd find that interesting. Depending on exactly where you work, I guess, and exactly what you're hauling, there isn't necessarily always a lot of money in doing that. And so he decided to get into the wrestling business. I don't know if somebody recommended that he do that or if he just was a fan and thought of it on his own. But in any event, that's why he got into the business. He wanted to make money. He wanted to make more money than what he was making before. So he figured naively, well, if I get into the wrestling business, I'll make more money than I'm making now. And then he kind of joked. He said that didn't exactly always turn out to be the case. And it's very sad because apparently, and I have not had the chance to read his book. I've read excerpts of his book before. I didn't buy the book. I don't own it. But apparently in his book, he spends a lot of time across multiple chapters of the book talking about the fact that he feels that he was cheated. He was cheated by a lot of the promoters that he worked for, Vince McMahon included. He was cheated out of money he felt he should have made when he was working, especially on top with guys like Hogan. Hogan was the golden goose. There's no way Kamala should have been paid exactly the same thing what Hogan was being paid. I can understand that because Hogan was the guy. But he was upset by this, I guess, large disparity between what somebody like Hogan was making and what somebody like him was making. Because I can understand that. I can understand if, let's say, Hogan was the guy, right? Or if it was another territory, if it was Lawler, if it was Dusty Rhodes, if it was Ric Flair. Like, that's your guy. And if that's the guy who's going to be paid the most, I understand that. But let's say, I don't know, I'm throwing random numbers out there, right? Let's say Dusty Rhodes is working, and it could be Kamala, it could be somebody else, right? He's working a Von Erich. But Dusty Rhodes is the established draw. He's the top star in the territory. Let's say for a big event or whatever, he's going to get paid $500,000, right? Well, I don't think that the Von Erich kid that he's working with should be making $500,000 like Dusty Rhodes, but should he be making $300,000? Should he be making $250,000? Should he be making something close to what he's making? Probably if he's a proven draw, right? Every great babyface needs a great heel to work with. Hogan and Piper, right? Early in Hogan's running the company. So, I mean, you can quibble about it. Well, how much should he have made and all that? I don't know. But I can understand if he wasn't making Hogan money. But I think the issue he had is it wasn't even that he wasn't making Hogan money. It was just that he wasn't even making what he felt would have been, a halfway decent wage for even being in the ring with somebody like Hogan. He just felt he was not paid what he should have been paid. He once made the comment, he said, I have no beef with Vince McMahon. Vince was always very kind to me, but in terms of payoffs, he thought the WWF was, in his words, disgusting. He said Mid-South Wrestling is the only place that he made real money. He was making between $3,500 and $4,000 a week at his peak while working there, $4,000 a week while he was working for Mid-South. He said he made enough money working for Bill Watts that he was able to buy his mother a nice house. Now, when he wasn't making a lot of money in WWE, he said during the interview with Hannibal that he loved working with the Ultimate Warrior. He joked because all of the matches they had together were 2 minutes long. So, of course, he loved working with the Warrior. It was the easiest thing in the world. They were in the ring for 2 minutes. Warrior, I'm sure, would probably go over in every match, and they'd go back and hit the shower. So it was the easiest thing in the world. But because a lot of the stories we tend to hear about the Warrior are, rightfully are negative. I mean, it's not like he's being unfairly picked on. There's plenty of stories from multiple people out there talking about what it was like to work with the Ultimate Warrior, what kind of person he was like. But it is nice to mention a few positive stories when people have positive things to say about him. He said the Warrior knew that he wasn't making a lot of money, and he's not sure exactly how the Warrior knew that. He's not sure how he knew what he was making. But I guess people talk, people chatter. So Warrior one day, he told Kamala, he said, look, I make a lot of money and Vince pays for me to ride in a limo. You can ride with me anytime you want. And so Kamala, I don't know if he ever took him up on that or not, but Warrior said to him, look, you ever want to ride with me in the limo? You come on in. And he said the Warrior would put him up sometimes at like really nice fancy hotels that Warrior would stay at. So if there was a nice Hilton hotel, let's say that somebody like Warrior, Hogan would be staying at, Kamala was usually at the Red Roof Inn, Quality Inn. He would stay at a crappier hotel to try to save money. He would be at these rundown like roach motels basically. And the Warrior sometimes would put him up in the Hilton. He said back in those days, Kamala said he was probably making around $1,500 a match. So basically $1,500 a night. And that's not accounting for road expenses. So you have $1,500. Then from that, you got to deduct, whatever, gas, car rental, food, whatever it may be. By the time you're done, you're left with almost nothing. You're traveling all over the place, all these cities and states and countries in some cases. And what may, to some people, sound like a lot of money, when you really think about it, really isn't that much at all. So what he would do is he would sometimes sleep in his rental car to try to save money. Warrior would put him up at the Hilton. And then he would say to the Warrior, all right, how much is the room? Or like, how much do I owe you? And the Warrior would tell him, don't worry about it. And he never had to pay him a dime. That's cool. That's one of those rare, cool stories about the Ultimate Warrior, because there's a lot of really negative stories. And so I thought it was a nice little balance to hear from somebody who, in their experience, said he was very kind to me. Now, in 1992, he came back to WWE. He had that feud with The Undertaker. They had their big Summerslam match at Wembley Stadium. He claimed he made $13,000 for that match. And Steve Lombardi, who worked for The Office, Brooklyn Brawler, told him that The Undertaker made $500,000 for that show. So that goes back to what I was talking about in terms of that pay disparity. If it's true, $500,000, $13,000. If those numbers are true, that's quite a disparity there. He said Lombardi was in the office. Obviously, he had access to certain people and may have had access to certain things other people didn't have access to. And he claimed that Lombardi told him there was a room he ran into one day. It was Pat Patterson's room or office or whatever. And Lombardi ran into the room where Pat Patterson was. I'll bet he ran into Patterson's room. But Patterson, I guess, had left his briefcase. Patterson wasn't in there. There was a briefcase there. And so Lombardi was rummaging through his papers. And he claims that he saw what Kamala made. And he said, Kamala said he nailed the exact amount. So when he said that The Undertaker made $500,000 for that match, he could never prove it. He could never prove that was true. But because he hit the nail on the head with what he made, he believed that to be true. He believed that to be the case. Now, I can believe that Kamala made $13,000. By that point in 92, he wasn't positioned as like a headline attraction the way he was in the mid-80s. But I find it impossible to believe that The Undertaker, back then, that early in his career, even though he was already a star at that point, he was, but I find it impossible to believe that at that point The Undertaker made that much money in one night for what was not even one of the main events on the show. It wasn't even the main event of the night. And in 92, WWE business was not good. They did put 80,000 people in Wembley Stadium that night, but business was hardly booming that year. So it's very hard for me to believe that that's the case. But the two of them, they went on to have, and by the way, on the subject of that SummerSlam show, there must have been a lot of really unhappy people coming out of Wembley. We all know the situation with Road Warrior Hawk, although that wasn't a pay issue. I don't think that was a whole other issue. And that was his last night with the company. Apparently he went AWOL and never, traveled back to the States with everybody. He and the Berserker, they went off and did God knows what. Nails, right? The famous story of Nails. Months later, when they found out what their payoffs were, he was not happy about what he had gotten paid, I think, for a frickin' match with Virgil. Didn't he wrestle Virgil on the show or something? He was very upset by his pay at SummerSlam, and that's what led to him physically choking Vince McMahon. He was trying to choke Vince McMahon to death. People had to pull nails off of Vince McMahon. And that was the nails in his coffin, you might say. That was the end of his career in WWE. So a lot of unhappy people, it seems, coming out of that Wembley show. But speaking of caskets, that was the big payoff to the feud with Undertaker and Kamala at the Survivor Series in '92. It was not the first casket match. There was at least one casket match that Dusty Rhodes had. I don't remember who it was against. I think it was late 70s, early 80s, somewhere in that period. So Undertaker was not the first man, believe it or not, to wrestle in a casket match, even though you would think it was the gimmick and everything. But no, there was at least one, if not more than one casket match in other territories before. And after that came the babyface turn, where they took this Ugandan monster and they turned him into a human being and they tried to humanize him, and the Reverend Slick was trying to teach him how to go bowling. He was trying to teach him how to be a man and not a savage. And I remember that segment. It was from one of the Coliseum home video releases where he takes Kamala bowling and he taught Kamala how to bowl. Not very well, but he tried to teach him how to bowl. There was a lot of really goofy stuff going on back then in WWE. But then again, we just got done with weeks and weeks and weeks of segments like that with the Street Profits and the Viking Raiders, right? Where they went bowling and golfing and axe throwing. So as goofy as things were back then, it's every bit as goofy still today. In all the years he spent in WWE, Kamala never competed on a WrestleMania card. He did have a match with Bam Bam Bigelow that was scheduled for WrestleMania 9. But it got scratched before the show. It was the sacrificial lamb of the show. According to Bruce Pritchard on his podcast, it had nothing to do with any of the matches going long, time running out on something. They made the call before the show started to cut the match to give Hulk Hogan lots of time to pose with the championship at the end of the night. And so that was the match they decided to cut. That was as close as he ever came to having a singles match at a WrestleMania. I should qualify that because he actually was part of the Gimmick Battle Royal many years later at WrestleMania 17. So I guess technically he did have a WrestleMania match. I was talking more in terms of like a big singles match or a tag team match or something. In that early run, it never happened. Now, Hogan is the one who got him into WCW in 1995. He got him into the company, into the Dungeon of Doom for a while, which was really just a group of heels for Hogan to beat. But work is work, right? So he got him a job there, and oh God, I mean, the Dungeon of Doom, we had Kamala, we had Earthquake playing the role of Shark, we had Beefcake playing the role of, what was it, the Butcher or Zodiac, or whichever one of his 21 gimmicks he was portraying at that time. His matches in the 90s were terrible. I mean, let's just call a spade here. I mean, his matches in the 90s were terrible. There's just no sugarcoating it. They were no good. His matches in the 80s, though, were better. And I would dare say, if you go back and watch some of the Kamala matches from the 80s and some of the big matches he had with Lawler and Hogan and people like that, in terms of ring psychology and him portraying that character as a monster, and he had athleticism to him. I'm watching Kamala do leapfrogs in the ring and stuff. His work in the 80s was far more memorable than the stuff he was doing, in the ring in the 90s, which, just like I said, was not very good. But again, it was more about the gimmick. It was more about the gimmick, not so much about going in there and working holds. The same thing with The Undertaker. Undertaker had that problem when he came into WWE. He was an athletic big guy. He was 6'9", 6'9", 6'10", and he could do things in the ring that you wouldn't expect a guy that big to be able to do. But he had to force himself, as he said in his documentary. He said this when he was on the podcast with Austin. He had to force himself to dial it back. He would bust out the flying clothesline. He could walk the top rope, but a lot of the cool stuff he wanted to do, he couldn't do it because it wouldn't have made any sense for that Undertaker character to be doing planchas and ranas and things. It just wouldn't have made sense. You have to work, especially back then, you worked like a big man would work. And that's what Kamala did, and he did a great job of that. Would he have been able to show off more of his athleticism if he was not necessarily portraying that character? Maybe. Even just doing a leapfrog was impressive for a guy of that size. But it was about the character. It wasn't about the work rate. It wasn't about, the holds and the moves the way that it is today. So I said the gimmick battle royal, I believe he was in that at WrestleMania 17. He had an independent match against Daniel Bryan. Bryan Danielson and Kamala had a match on the independent scene in 2006. That same year, he wrestled his final WWE match ever on Monday Night Raw against Umaga, another character. And this was the brainchild of Vince McMahon. This was, in this case, it wasn't an African savage. He was a Samoan savage. I even felt that way when I saw the Umaga character back then. But by that point, it just felt like we were so far beyond the cartoony days of characters like that. Umaga was a very talented, athletic, bigger guy. But that character was just so goofy in 2006, and I couldn't understand. He's talented, but like when you did that big match at WrestleMania 23, the Battle of the Billionaires, and you had Lashley, and you had Umaga, and I just thought to myself, what a mistake. Why would you pick a character like that for an angle that's going to go mainstream? You know what I mean? Like it's going to be in the news. And here you have a character that's straight out of 1985. Like of all the people you could have picked for that spot, why did you pick that character? It just never made a whole lot of sense to me. It just felt very out of place. Like the Kamala character would have, and a lot of those 80s and 90s characters would feel out of place today. Just in its time it worked, and now it just would not work. Because that's just not what people that's just not what people expect when they watch wrestling today. I'm all for great character work and gimmicks and stuff, but when it comes to stuff like that, it doesn't work as well as it worked when we were all a lot younger and people believed. I think that's the biggest reason why. I'm not against having a great wrestling character. It doesn't always have to be just about who can do the most dives and who can do the most flashy moves. It's great that you got guys who can do flashy moves and all that kind of stuff. You need that. You need that variety on the card. But I think the issue is that when it comes to a Kamala character or an early Undertaker character, especially when you're a kid, right? But even if you're not necessarily a kid, you go back 30 years, 35 years, it was a different time where people in a lot of cases could believe. They could buy into the fact. Look at this guy. This looks like a guy they plucked off the street who doesn't know what he's doing. He's this wild man. He's a monster. And it was just something that you could almost buy into or be afraid of, right, if you were a young kid. And it's not always like that today. It's just a different time. So there's apparently a story in his book. And the name of the book, by the way, if you are interested in picking it up, is called Kamala Speaks. It is on Amazon, I noticed. But apparently there was a story in his book. It's kind of a sad story. And it's like a quick anecdote that he shares. I think it was maybe 1994. This was after his run had ended the previous year with WWE. There was a tragedy in his family. He stepped away from wrestling. He went back to driving a truck. He was back to being a truck driver. And he had to make a delivery, as it turns out, to Madison Square Garden. He had to make a delivery to Madison Square Garden, the same building where he once headlined against Hulk Hogan in front of a sold-out crowd for the heavyweight championship of the world. And here he is making a delivery to the same building. He had no idea that WWE was running a show that same day. They were running a show that night, and so WWE was there, the production trucks were there, they were getting ready for the show that night. He had no idea when he showed up to make this delivery, and he just wanted to get in and out. I don't know if it was shame, if it was embarrassment, I don't know. But he just wanted to get in, get out, do what he had to do, not get noticed, and just get out of there. And sure enough, who does he happen to bump into but Vince McMahon? Because Vince, I'm sure, he's probably the first person at the building, and he's in there making a delivery. I guess they're unloading stuff off of the pallets from his truck or whatever, but there's Vince McMahon. And Vince is just having some small talk and chatting him up and patting this guy on the back. And Kamala says he never realized who he was. Even though Vince was chatting with him and patting him on the back and everything, he did not know that it was Kamala. He just thought it was a friendly delivery driver. He had no idea that this was the guy who once worked for him and made money for him and headlined shows in that building for him. And there is just something so sad about that. So his health, unfortunately, just deteriorated very quickly as the years went on. Apparently, he was told as early as 1992 that he should get on kidney dialysis, and he was having these health issues, but he was still wrestling. And so he decided to just keep working, and he wasn't going to get treatment. And as the years went on, doctors would tell him, you really should do this. And he was like, no. And he kept wrestling, and he was doing independent dates. And then it just got to a point later, 2010-ish, like in that range, where his health issues caught up to him. And he had to have some toes amputated from his feet. And then he made the decision, okay, let's do this. Let's do the dialysis and all that. But, by that point, it was too late. He had waited so many years and had foregone treatment that maybe would have helped him avoid all of that. Unfortunately for him, it was too late. And so the amputated toes turned into amputated feet, which turned into amputated legs. That's what diabetes does, unfortunately. It's a horrible disease. And so he had a lot of very serious health problems, And then 3 years ago, he had an issue with his heart and his lungs, and I guess there was fluid that had to be drained. He was in the hospital. He ended up on life support. He almost died. He almost died 3 years ago. I think he had another health issue last year where he almost died. And every time he was able to pull through. That thing 3 years ago, he lapsed into a coma, I think, for a week. Or maybe it was a medically induced coma, I think he said. Some really serious stuff. But he pulled through. He fought through it. He pulled through. And in the end, he was okay. Until now. And unfortunately, this time he wasn't able to pull through. And you may not know this. Here's something else you may not know that's kind of cool about Kamala. You may not know the fact that he once recorded his own album. The Best of Kamala Singing, Volume 1. I don't believe there was ever a Volume 2. Although there could have been. He could have done one if he wanted to, because I actually think he had a pretty good voice. But yes, James Harris enjoyed singing. I want to say the album was recorded sometime in the mid to late 90s, somewhere around there. Later on in his life, and actually it might have been during the interview with Hannibal, he was asked, do you still sing? And he said he wasn't singing anymore because his equipment that he had broken and he couldn't afford new equipment, but he had loved singing. You can listen to all 10 tracks if you want to. It's on the Iron On Wrestling YouTube channel. That's the YouTube channel for independent wrestler Gregory Irons. You can catch the full album. It's on there. It's in one video on his channel. I guess a friend of his show came into possession of the album many years ago. And he sings about a whole bunch of different things. He sings about his granddaughter. He sings about racism in wrestling, other subjects as well. So anyway, if you want to give it a listen, the title on YouTube is Kamala Singing. Rare full album. I think, again, he had a good voice for it. I'll say that much. He had a good voice for it. But it's very unfortunate, the health issues that he had. The man, if you really think about his career and his life, he had an amazing run. He had an amazing run and probably does not get the credit for it that he deserves. I mean, think of all the territories that this guy worked for, from Memphis to Mid-South to World Class with the Von Erichs, WWE, multiple runs across multiple eras of WWE, AWA, WCW, All Japan, CMLL in Mexico. The names he worked with, on top in a lot of cases, especially in the 80s. Hogan, Savage, Andre, Warrior, Undertaker, Lawler, Bruiser Brody, the Von Erichs, Mil Mascaras. And the biggest thing is he made money. In most of the places that he went, he made money. He made, not maybe he didn't. I'm talking the money he made for the promotion. He generated money. Unfortunately, it sounds like he made money for a lot of people, but not always enough for himself.